Good evening, and thank you for joining us for another Northshire Presents virtual event. I'm Rachel Person, an event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, and we have another location in Manchester Center, Vermont. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Before we get started, a couple of very quick notes. First of all, thank you for your support of independent bookselling. We couldn't do events like this and all the things that we do in our communities without the incredible loyalty and support of customers like you. So thank you so much for that incredible support. And then a logistical note, please use the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, to pose any questions that you have for our guests this evening. You can put questions there at any time. I'll save them up and I'll pose them for you at the end of the night. So please make liberal use of that Q&A box. That's the boring stuff. I'm so very pleased to get to introduce Kevin Griffin this evening as he celebrates his book, Living Kindness, Metta Practice for the Whole of Our Lives. He is a leader in the mindful recovery movement and a community Dharma leader at Spirit Rock Meditation Center, and is the author of 5 previous books, including the best-selling Buddhist recovery book, One Breath at a Time. He has studied with the leading Western Vipassana teachers, including Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, and Ajahn Amaro. He lives in the Bay Area and regularly teaches and leads retreats in the Insight Meditation community. He will be interviewed tonight by author, speaker, life coach, and recovery expert, Valerie, Vimalasara, Mason-John. They are the award-winning author and editor of 10 books, most recently, I Am Still Your Negro, an homage to James Baldwin, and African Wisdom, New Voices Talk Black Liberation, Buddhism, and Beyond. Their TEDx talk, We Are What We Think, has been seen by over 300,000 viewers, and they are the co-founder of the accredited program, Mindfulness-Based Addiction Recovery. Please join me in welcoming them both to our screens this evening.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, Vimalasara.
Yeah, hi. I like to think, Kevin, we'll have a conversation rather than me interviewing you.
Yeah, no, please.
So, actually, when the book came across my desk and I saw the front cover and saw Living Kindness, I was like, wow, that's a very interesting concept. Where did that? Yeah, tell me a bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just thought it was a great title. And as an author yourself, you know how hard it can be to find the right title. And when you find one, yes. So, but of course, it expanded and it expresses exactly what I wanted to do with this book, which was take the idea of loving kindness beyond just sitting on a cushion and having thoughts, and feelings of loving kindness, but what does it mean beyond that? And then it also became this, other things, a sutta study and kind of trying to find the many dimensions of loving kindness besides the obvious one of feeling that, so I wanted to be able to talk about the hindrances and concentration and fear and all these other elements. So it kind of piled up then.
Yeah, I mean, actually, just as you was talking, I was thinking, this is definitely a great book for activists, because often, and not just activists, but for those of us who are Buddhist practitioners and activists, because one of the things when I opened it up and I looked at the chapters and I thought, oh, the soul simile. So what's he going to say about in this soul simile? And so I'm really going to jump right in. I'm experiencing a lot of activation right now because of what's happening in Uganda towards LGBTQ people, like even identifying as gay, you could get a life sentence. What's happening in Florida?
Yeah.
So how do we practice? It's how do we allow people to carve us up savagely, limb by limb? Yeah. How do we practice?
When I was working on the book, I asked Ajahn Pasno, who's a really leading Westerner who's a Buddhist monk, has been a Buddhist monk for over 40 years. I asked him to look at the manuscript, and I really asked him kind of this question, because the simile of the saw, for those who aren't familiar with it, it has a a climactic line where the Buddha says, even if bandits were severing your limbs one by one with a two-handled saw, if a thought of ill will arises, then you are not following my teachings. And, it's a crazy kind of suggestion, and hopefully we never get tested on that one. And I said, does this mean we're just supposed to be passive and just let bad things happen? And he said, no, look, it says, if a thought of ill will, it doesn't say don't act. It doesn't say be passive. It doesn't say you can't protect yourself or protect others or take, really assertive steps. But it says, don't let your mind become, captured by hatred. Because one of the teachings I love is the suggesting that when you get angry with your enemy, you're giving your enemy what they want. You're making yourself suffer. And that's what your enemy wants. So if you can not be filled with hatred and yet stand up to injustice, that's the goal. And I certainly won't claim that I've attained that goal. I struggle with it literally every day. I subscribe to the New York Times, and
this is the emptiness teaching, basically.
Yeah.
It's an emptiness teaching. Yeah.
And that's why the chapter after that on the simile of the saw is called the Greed, Hatred, and Delusion Report. And which is just what I call the news, the Greed, Hatred, and Delusion Report, and realizing that in the time of the Buddha, there was greed, hatred, and delusion. And throughout history, there's been greed, hatred, and delusion. And today, there's greed, hatred, and delusion. So just as you're saying about emptiness, we just see that this isn't unique to our time or our situation. It just manifests in its own unique ways in each generation. But somehow we have to be able to hold the great view, the view of emptiness, and the reality that's unacceptable in front of us, and stand up to that. I think that's the real challenge for modern day Buddhists, because I think that I think that this is one of the things that Westerners have brought to Buddhism, really an insistence that it not be a passive practice, that it not just be monastics and then other people go and bow to the monastics and whatever's going on outside the monastery, we don't worry about that.
What Martin Luther King brought to Buddhism was his description of the three poisons of militarism, poverty, and racism. You can really see how they got the intersectionality of the traditional three poisons. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Let's bring it back to something that we can all connect to: attachment. Why? It's great. It's lovely just reading more about attachment and how you bring yourself in of having a daughter. The attachment to the daughter. And actually, it was my partner who underlined this part of, actually, when a loved one dies, this can be a doorway to awakening. Can you say a bit more about that?
Oof. I remember hearing Stephen Levine years ago, very early in my practice, and he taught a lot around death and dying. And I remember him telling a story about a woman whose son was a surfer and had been attacked by a shark and killed. And she went to identify him and saw his body. And he said that she had this enlightenment experience in that moment because she was forced to let go and see and accept the that there was nothing to hold on to, that everything is impermanent. And we hear that teaching over and over, it's an easy one to just, oh yeah, everything's impermanent, man, but I think, enlightenment seems like, sometimes it's a shock. Sometimes we need to be shocked in order to have a breakthrough. I mean, certainly in Zen, they use those kind of, the koan is meant to kind of create a shock in the brain, in the mind. So yeah, I think that if we are able to absorb the deeper meaning of loss, that it can be freeing.
I mean, it's interesting you saying that, because it reminds me of a conversation recently. My friend's partner actually works out in disaster zones and, trains people to do what to do in disaster zones. And he's a Quaker. And, I kind of asked, what is it that you believe in? And he said, I have faith in God. I just know my faith in God that everything's going to be okay. And I said, I have faith in impermanence.
Mm-hmm.
And know that everything's going to be okay. And it's something that I just know that everything changes, whether I like it or not.
Yeah.
Whether I protest against it or not, things change. And hooray! Can you imagine, Kevin, you were still like you were when you were 16, 18, 20? Could you imagine?
Yeah, there's if you want to have the one part of it, you're going to have to accept the whole story. It's like, yeah, you'll be young, but you'll be young.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I feel the same way, that impermanence is just frees me in so many ways, especially, I get stuck in moods from time to time, most every day, and remembering that they're going to pass is one of my key practices. I realized, like, when I really had trouble, emotional problems, a lot of it was, what sustained it was my feeling that it was permanent, and thinking it was permanent made it stick around longer, because it created a feedback loop, a negative feedback loop in my mind. Like, oh, I'm depressed. Oh, I'm always going to be depressed. Well, that's depressing. Oh, and it just, so yeah, it is
depressible, actually, in your book.
Depressible, yes. There's irritable. I said, why can't there be depressible as well? I don't know, coining a new term.
I had some freedom today, because, with this thing of impermanence, it's interesting that, in terms of work, there's this conflict. And I'd reached out to these people saying, we need to have a team meeting. And this is like almost 2 weeks ago. And they were sending other emails and didn't respond. And then again, it's like, email and didn't respond. And then today I just thought, I could just let go of this. It was just like the freedom of just that impermanence, in that you can just let go of this.
Yeah.
Just let it go. And there is, these teachings are definitely about freedom. So just coming to that is why, if you could just, in your words, why does attachment cause so much suffering?
Mm-hmm. Right. So that's one of the suttas that I address in the book, is about how attachment causes suffering. And well, fundamentally, attachment is the wish for something to stay the same. And so it has to fail. That has to be, that's not going to happen. And so we inevitably are going to feel the grief of that loss. So it's just part of the structure of it, right? You have the reality of impermanence, and then you have the mind wanting it not to change. So that conflict, impermanence is always going to win in that conflict, but this is like, again, in one of these teachings, and I think a lot of what I'm trying to do is say, yes, and I think this is generally my teaching. Yes, there are these ideals, but let's not just turn them into solid ideas like, well, attachment causes suffering, so you shouldn't have attachment. Like, no, that doesn't make sense. Human beings, emotionally healthy human beings, have emotionally healthy attachment. That's part of it. So to me, this teaching doesn't mean, well, everything is impermanent and attachment causes suffering, so don't have suffering. No, it means when you see the truth, you don't suffer in the same way. It doesn't mean you don't feel anything. It doesn't mean you don't feel sadness or loss. But in that sutta, the man is, lost his mind, and we've seen people, who can't deal with loss, and that's because they don't fundamentally understand, oh, this is inevitable. So to me, that's the bargain we make as human beings, being born into this existence. The bargain we make is, I'm going to suffer. I'm going to have attachment. I'm going to have loss, and there's going to be pain around that. And that's okay. Like, that's okay. It's when we make it not okay, that's when we have a problem. I think. I mean, maybe there are people who have no attachments. I don't know.
As you just say it so succinctly, you're really giving us the teaching of the two dark teaching.
Yeah.
That there is impermanency. It is going to be painful. We're not saying it's going to be painful, but actually it's the second dark we stab ourselves with. It's not okay. We can't come to terms with it. And that's the extra suffering that we
And I think you can get that, right, in meditation. It's one of the real values of meditation, is kind of watching, like, oh, here's this, oh, look what I just did, that thought I brought in and how that made this situation worse. And it's a significant difference. I'm not sure, that teaching, the two arrows, the first arrow is the inevitable pain, and the second arrow is the one that we bring to it. I think that first arrow is a lot smaller than the second one, and so that metaphor doesn't quite work for me, because I feel like the second one is what really takes it from, oh, that's unpleasant, to, oh, it kind of pushes it over the edge. I don't know. Can we come up with a new version of that? The arrow and the howitzer. We can have it be that.
I'm sure we could. That's for the next book.
Yes. Okay. But you're going to have to write it. I'm too tired.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to this thing of, why is it so difficult to love ourselves? And I know you refer to it in the book around the Dalai Lama. Everybody, we always hear the Dalai Lama was like completely shocked, self-hatred. What's self-hatred? But is there really a culture that does not struggle with self-love?
I'm, like you, I think I'm skeptical of that too. And I think that Western Buddhists have, part of our, culture is to sort of exoticize the East and make, Asian Buddhists, they're so, the Dalai Lama, he's so perfect. It's like, I think we're all just people. So yeah, I don't know if there is a culture where people don't. Maybe we're more self-obsessed, and we have a very individualist culture, at least in America.
That's it. I mean, one of my Asian students said to me, he said, we talk in the we, and in the West talk in the I, that we're collective. So there is that difference. Yeah.
But I think, my explanation of self-hatred partly is we just know ourselves so well. And because all people are imperfect, we can't help but be like, oh boy, I've got problems. And, there's a saying in AA, like comparing your insides to other people's outsides. Like other people look like they've got it all together until you actually probe underneath the surface and find out that, yeah, we're all kind of got our stuff. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think is behind self-hatred?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it is something that I was very much assailed by as a young person. And actually, that self-hatred came from hatred that was projected towards me in my childhood conditioning. I don't need to go into detail. And so, in a sense that if I hated myself, nobody could hate me or reject me in the same way. So very much, I think sometimes that self-hatred can be a protector.
Yeah.
It's protecting us. It's a protector. We have to remember that. And at some point, thankfully, I've let go of that. I mean, when I first came to the rooms of Buddhism and Metta, I've got like this. I was like this, Kevin. I was like this, and I was like saying, I hate myself 10 to 1,000. It was like, oh, my 20s. And yeah, and that's something that I've worked with. And again, I think something about comparing your insides to the outsides. And of course, we know it's a hindrance, ill will. I mean, when we talk about these hindrances, it isn't just ill will towards others, it's ill will towards ourselves. And especially if you've grown up in a dysfunctional household, it can be very easy to have this, which is why it's so important, that mother's love, isn't it? We talk about the Metta Sutta, and it opens up, about the mother's love, but not every child gets that.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I was very conscious of that when writing about that, like, because the assumption in the early Buddhist tradition is that mother love is a reliable thing that everyone gets, and we know, like, certainly in our times, that's not always the case. But I really relate to that idea that you put out about, like, if I judge myself first, then nobody can get me. Kind of like, oh, I already know that. Like, you can't insult me because I already insulted myself. I'm going to put myself down in front of people so that they won't be able to put me down or something. It's like,
and then what happens is, I mean, I know from my own exploration, I mean, I really matched it with I love myself, and realizing that wasn't enough, and got to the point where there's no self to hate, there's no self to love.
Yeah.
And, realizing that actually, if that mental state ever arises, it's just vulnerability. But it's so easy to flee to the familiar and not to be with the vulnerability. And I think this is what people need to be really aware of, that actually sometimes it can be so painful, so excruciating to be with the vulnerability, that we flee to the familiar, flee to that negative voice.
That's really well put. It's a really, really good insight. And it, as you're suggesting, like in moments of stress, or in difficult moments, or in moments of activation, that we fall into those things.
That's it. It's so easy. You give a public talk, and people, I mean, I hear people like vomiting, birthing after a public talk. I know people who do. I know people take pills before they perform and whatever, but you come off and it's like, maybe, people looked at you the wrong way, you didn't, and you feel this vulnerability, and it's so quick for this self-hatred to come in and beat yourself up. Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking that the people who were listening were vomiting, but that's good that they wouldn't want that. But then it is bad. And you're really like, oh, that was terrible.
Yeah, yeah.
God, that's rough. I don't have
Yeah.
that. I just have the usual self-judgment afterward. But I will say, since you brought that up, that I'll kind of bring up one of the points that I have in the book, which is that I think when we say self-love, I think people get the idea that they're supposed to really like themselves and think like, oh, I'm so wonderful. And that's not really self-love. That's about ego or, narcissism, and the idea of kind of qualifying, oh, am I good enough? And rather, as I say, I prefer the idea of self-care, when we take care of ourselves, because that's something I learned to do, in recovery and as a Dharma practitioner. No matter what my mood is, I take care of myself, because I used to not take care of myself. And so even if I'm not liking myself, I still make sure I get rest and I, get exercise and eat well and, take care, just take care, and that to me is living kindness, right? It's loving myself in a very practical way. And that's one of the things that I like to bring out of the Dharma, because we can get into the lofty ideas and lose touch with just the day-to-day life of living in a body and living in a mind. And how do I take care of myself? How do I have a pleasant existence? And how do I bring joy into my life? And just self-care. And then I can think whatever I want about myself, but it's not really nearly as destructive if I'm actually taking care of myself. And taking care of myself tends to then lay the foundation for better mind states as well.
Keeps Mara at bay, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because again, I always call it an attack of Mara when we're into those mental states. And I know that if I don't give myself enough sleep, if I don't feed myself properly, if I don't practice, all that, definitely. That self-care is so important.
And it can be this kind of competition between your mind, the negativity of the mind, and your willingness to like, no, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm still going to do what I need to do.
Let's I wanted to come back to this practice of metta, because I've heard people teaching saying, oh, metta has become so boring, and always having to radiate warmth and kindness to these people, and it's got a bit stale. And I really loved, I think, as I was saying earlier before we came on screen, that I really liked how you unpacked metta and included it as things of sila, as things of non-ill will, and just even you included it as liberation. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that for you. What does metta mean?
Yeah. Well, again, it comes back to the title, that it's not, sitting there and meditating and trying to generate a feeling that's going to be impermanent anyway, but rather more about an attitude, a way of seeing the world, bringing, in some ways, I think compassion is more important to me than loving kindness, because that's the thing that gets me through the day a lot. It's compassion for other people and compassion for myself, and seeing the world through this lens of the Four Noble Truths of people are suffering, and can I bring compassion to them? And before I can. So if we're going to sort of talk about these different levels, you kind of starting with sila, which is the sort of ethical behavior and living wisely. Before you're going to try to meditate and generate some positive mind state, you have to have positive behavior as a foundation, or else when you sit down, it's just all that negative energy appears. So sila is is fundamental. In a lot of ways, for me, when I started to practice 40 years ago, I was all about like enlightenment and emptiness. And now I'm much more interested in sila. I feel like if I'm living wisely day by day, that everything builds on that. And then, doing metta practice helps me to work with the 5 hindrances when ill will arises. I have a way of working with it, of encountering it, of understanding that this ill will is causing me suffering, and that and that it's not that I should like wipe out the ill will because that's bad. It's not like a moral issue. It's a issue of suffering, and realizing that I have to start by actually giving love to the ill will, and kindness to my own anger, to understand, because a lot of times ill will has got some logic behind it. It's not just irrational. It's like, okay, I need to hold this tenderly and kindly and see if I can transform it into something constructive, just like we were talking about activism. I mean, that can appear as ill will, but does that mean I should get rid of the ill will? No, it means I need to transform it into some positive action. So it's each step of the way, to me, really addressing things in a very authentic way, not idealizing, I'm not supposed to have anger, so I better but building and then using the concentration that comes from metta. A lot of teachers, they're not that interested in like heart opening and love, but they see that, I don't know if I should, a lot of teachers, but I've heard this anyway, that they use the practice as a way of entering into the deeper concentration states. So that's really interesting to me. It's like, so you're not really about the feeling. You're about the mind state. And of course, that mind state of concentration is already going to be a positive and, constructive mind state anyway. But the metta practice, because it's so well structured, can really capture the concentration.
Yeah. I just, I know that we're wanting people who are listening to ask some questions, but I just wanted to ask you this. What is it that you want people to take away from this book? What I take away actually from this book is that finally there's another book that I can say to people who want to know about metta. There's another book alongside Sharon's book, because for so long there's just been Sharon's book, which is a great book.
Yeah.
And it's, it was written over 20 so years ago, and this is a great compliment for me to actually say to people, you know what, this is Living Kindness is a great book. It's accessible. It really unpacks metta and really, includes some of the sutta teachings, which I think are applicable to the practice of metta. But what are you hoping people will take away from reading this book?
Well, first of all, thank you for those kind words. And what I'm hoping is that it's going to really open up people's ideas about metta, because I've been concerned that there was a limited idea of what it meant. And I wanted people to see that there's many dimensions that they can draw on. And at different times, you can draw on these different dimensions. And that's the primary goal in this book, is to really show that it can be something that pervades your life and touches many different realms, and that can be in your meditation and can be outside your meditation, and in your activism and in your social interaction and in your family practice. I've had people say, my practice is so weak right now because I've got little kids. I'm like, what do you mean you're practicing loving kindness every day?
That's it. That's it.
I'm not meditating enough. I'm like, well, yeah, but it's time for, to everything there is a season. Now, this is the season of loving children. That's a good season.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should we see if there's any questions coming in from Rachel?
Yes, I do have some questions that have been sent.
Good.
And audience members, if you have other questions, please type them into the Q&A box and I will pose them for you. I'll get to as many as I can in the time we have left. The first one came from Angela, and she would like to know, how does the content of this book connect to your work in recovery?
Well, it's, I actually made an effort to not talk a lot about addiction in this book because I wanted to reach a broader Buddhist audience. And because so much of my work has been around recovery and addiction, I've sort of felt that the larger Buddhist audience maybe wasn't paying attention to me. Wanted more attention. But of course, when it comes back to recovery, we realize that addiction is very much an expression of self-hatred. And the pain of the addict is the pain of hatred for self and hatred for the world oftentimes. And sometimes addiction is very much a reaction to seeing the suffering of the world and not knowing what to do with it, and either being angry or wanting to withdraw from it. And so it certainly touches that area of my work. Yeah.
Thank you. Todd posed this question for both of you, asking, do you have more advice for returning hostility or anger with kindness, perhaps from your own personal experiences?
Well, I want Vimalasara to answer a question, so I don't have to do everything.
Can you say that question one more time, Rachel?
Yeah.
Yes. Do you have more advice for returning hostility or anger with kindness, perhaps from your own personal life or experiences?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Todd. I would say that when we are still full of anger and we're still full of ill will, that we're not in a place to actually return to the person with compassion. We're just not this. It's just impossible when we're full of anger. And so basically the person who needs the compassion is ourselves. So that when our mind is consumed by hatred and we're in, if we think of the wheel of life, we're definitely either in that hell realm or the Titan realm. When the mental state's in one of those realms, we need to be giving ourselves compassion. We need to be taking care about, as Kevin says, self-care. And, and then when we experience that anger and ill will dissolving and beginning to dissolve, then perhaps we're ready to radiate compassion towards the person who's caused us harm. And it may be a back and forth. You may begin to radiate it and boom, the anger and agitation arises. And if it does, you come back to yourself and you give yourself self-love and you give yourself compassion. So that's what I'd say. When your mind is consumed by anger and ill will, do not try and be giving compassion to others. You need to be giving it to yourself. That's my advice.
I like that. I think that's exactly right. Sometimes we want to jump right from, I'm going to fix this, rather than like addressing the inner experience. I mean, if I can add one other piece, is that in that going into our own suffering is to see, and I think this is the nonviolent communication idea, that to see what it is that I need, or that's, what is this reaction about? Not just, oh, you're being mean or you're a jerk, but what is it in me that's really being touched, and how is that being touched? So that I can, if I am going to respond, I'll understand, oh, this is what's going on, rather than it's them that's doing it to me, rather than, oh, what is it in me that's really being triggered?
Yeah, because, often we know that when we have this strong reaction of anger or rage, knowing that this isn't the first time that this has happened to us, or we think somebody's doing something to us.
Right.
It's not the first time. So really to kind of unravel that and unpick that. Sometimes I always say, Kevin, I feel sorry for those people who remind you of your abuser, or remind you of somebody who was harsh to you as a child, because they haven't got much chance, isn't it? Sometimes we can just go into real aversion with somebody because it's the way somebody looks and we're not really aware that actually they remind us of somebody. So one of the things we can actually do is, when we're in conflict with somebody, who do they remind me of? And that can actually begin to soften what's going on. It's like, oh my God, actually, that's who they remind me of. That's familiar.
That's really interesting.
That's wonderful advice from both of you. Thank you so much. Sarah would like each of you to talk about some of the teachers who have influenced your work the most.
Well, for me, it's been, I started with the first two teachers that were really impactful for me were Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield. And, and I still have great admiration for them. There were a few people early on, Ruth Dennison and some of the people around her really showed me about breaking open preconceptions about the Dharma. Ruth was a remarkable and very iconoclastic kind of teacher. And so I kind of learned about crazy wisdom through her and some of the teachers around her, which I love. Crazy. I love that idea. You have to be careful. It can be abused, crazy wisdom, but the idea of being creative really with the Dharma. I think, Aya Kema, who was a German Buddhist nun, I learned her concentration system through Lee Brasington. She passed in the late 90s, and he's still teaching. And so that's really been influential in my meditation practice. And then Ajahn Amaro, who I mentioned before, who's currently the abbot of Amaravati Monastery in England. He's the person that I probably listen to the most, like his talks, and he's just he's a tremendous storyteller, and also brings in. I like currently probably the last decade or so, I'm really interested in the early Buddhist teachings, the suttas. And so Venerable Analayo, the great scholar, monk, has been hugely influential in that reflection. And so the book, Living Kindness, takes some suttas and tries to unpack them and make them very accessible, where they can seem very esoteric, kind of, when you're trying to read them without any context. So Analayo and Amaro particularly, and so I've kind of inclined more toward the following the monastics in recent years. Yeah. Vimalasara, do you want to mention some teachers?
Yeah, it's fascinating question in a way, because some of my teachers are the bodhisattvas, like Kuan Yin. And the stories of Kuan Yin, like I can remember years ago, just and I don't have that book, but the stories of Kuan Yin, before they were Kuan Yin, and Milarepa is somebody who really inspires me, and then my sadhana practice is Vajrasattva. I've just been reading up more on Vajrasattva and just really being inspired by that story, which is most probably why I gravitate to that. So, and definitely my biggest teacher is Shakyamuni. We go, for me, definitely inspired by their teachings. And I would say that the books of Thich Nhat Hanh, I remember The Miracle of Mindfulness, and reading that book and just being blown away. That was, like, I'd say, my first Dharma book that I read. I remember and then of course my root teacher, the founding teacher of my lineage, Sangharakshita, Venerable Sangharakshita, was amazing at making the Dharma really accessible. Yeah, very, very, very accessible. And then, you know, more like people like Larry Ward and Larry Yang have been inspirations for me. And then even in my own lineage, people like Amara Gita, you know, people might not have heard of those. That's from the British perspective. And then, you know, my students, we don't really call them students, but the people who we teach, they're my teachers.
Yeah.
They really they really inspire me. They're my teachers, and witnessing change. Yeah. So there's you know, there is a lot there. But you know, my most pivotal teacher is the Buddha Shakyamuni.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Good call.
So we are getting close to out of time, but I do have one great last question from Erica saying, can you talk about what you're working on now?
Yeah, so did I say this before we came on? So I've been writing for the past year about the Anapanasati Sutta, which is the discourse on mindfulness of breathing. And it's one of the two main meditation instructions in the Pali Canon, along with the four foundations of mindfulness. And Anapanasati is a very structured way of working with the breath, and it follows the foundations of mindfulness. So it's the first section of it. There are 16 steps divided into 4 tetrads. It's very, a lot of math in Buddhism, but so it's got 4 steps on body and breath, then 4 steps on feeling, 4 steps on mind, and then 4 steps on insights. And it's a very deep sutta. And I'm writing it as a conversation, more or less, with several other teachers, some of whom are alive, some of whom aren't. So sort of taking their books and reading them, and then at each step sort of examining what the different teachers say, including Analayo and Buddhadasa and Thich Nhat Hanh and Ajahn Pasanno and Bhikkhu Bodhi. So they're all monastics. So it's kind of, I'm calling it right now the wrestling with the Buddha, because that's what it feels like. I'm kind of struggling with my own understanding and sort of delving into, what makes sense to me and what doesn't, and how I interpret things, and it's very messy. And I don't know if it'll get published, because I don't know if I want to publish it.
It was one of my favorite practices, the Anapanasati, so I look forward to it coming out, if it comes out. Yeah. What am I working on? What I think, actually, to say, firstly, I'm working on myself. I've really kind of put myself into student as well. I think sometimes, I know that speaking in the eye, that, I can do so much teaching, and I think that's practice, and it's not practice, or practice in a different way. So I'm really, kind of working on myself, and really, really being disciplined, having an hour on the cushions in the morning, really reading Dharma, and just really, and that's really important. I think sometimes that can get lost. It's so definitely I'm working on myself, which impacts everything else. And so the two external, that's the inner, the two external things that really I'm working on is a book called A First Aid Kit for the Mind. It's a pocket book. And I just really, for me, I mean, maybe like to change the title and just call it Freedom, because I really do believe, Kevin, that these teachings are about freedom. And if we're not getting freedom, what's happening? Because it really, for me, is really where it's like about freedom. It's about unknowing ourselves. It's about unknowing ourselves. It's about unknowing everything. You know, we think we know, but we don't know. So really, that's, you know, what I'm working with. And I have a publisher. In fact, they've actually put it out, the title out, and it's like, what? The title may change. You know what I mean? They already put it out there on Amazon. I'm like, what? So, and then the other thing that which I was sharing with Kevin, I've been working over the past couple of years with a group of BIPOC people. We're about to launch a 1-year-long mindfulness course, which has been designed by Black Indigenous people of colour for Black and Indigenous people of colour. So that's a huge bit of creativity that's been working on. So those are the things that I'm working on.
Nice.
Wonderful. Well, both of you, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this evening. It's been just lovely and wonderful getting to hear you speak.
Thanks for having us. And really, I can't wait to visit your bookstore next time I'm upstate New York.
Yes, please do. And audience, you can find books by both of these wonderful authors at northshire.com, as well as a list of upcoming events. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great.
I want to hold up one of your books, but they're over there.
Oh,
so
nice. Great book. We're here for your book.
Thank you, Vimalasara. And thanks, Rachel, and thanks to Northshire for having us. It was really fun.
Yeah. Okay.
Great to see you.
Thank you, and have a good night, everyone.